Mr. Neeraj Tiwari, CEO of AMCHAM TT, Mr. Mariano Brong, CEO of the UWI Orthodox Jack Global School of Business, distinguished speakers, invited guests. Also want to recognize the President and Principal of COSTAT, Dr. Kishan, students, members of the media. Good morning. Wow, okay, I had breakfast. Good morning. All right, good to see you guys. My name is Karen Niles. I'm a lecturer at the Institute of International Relations at the University of the West Indies. It really is a pleasure to welcome each of you to today's session on climate change and COP27, the need for unified Caribbean leadership. That's hosted by AMCHAM TT in partnership with the University of the West Indies, the Institute of International Relations, and the UWI Orthodox Jack Global School of Business. I also want to welcome the audience that is joining us online, on Facebook to be specific. And to begin today's proceedings, I'd like to call on the CEO of the Orthodox Jack Global School of Business, Mr. Mariano Brong, who will deliver our welcome remarks. Mr. Mariano Brong, hold on, wait 1 second. Can have him come up and not read his bio. We'll get in trouble. So, Mr. Brong is the Chief Executive Officer of the UWI Orthodox Jack Global School of Business. He spent his professional life managing financial firms in the Caribbean. He was appointed as Senator in 2007 and has served as a Minister of Trade and a Minister in the Ministry of Finance during the period 2007 to 2010. Mr. Brong is an accountant by profession and is a fellow of the Association of Chartered Certified Accountants and a member of the Institute of Chartered Accountants of Trinidad and Tobago. Now, please welcome Mr. Mariano Brong, CEO of the Orthodox Jack.
Thank you very much, Kiran. Dr. Niles of the Institute of International Relations at UWI, President of AMCHAM, Neeraj Tiwari, Mr. Kishan Kumarsingh, Head of the Multilateral Environmental Agreements Unit, and Tisha Marajh, Senior Manager in charge of Sustainability at the Republic Bank. Thank you very much, and to all our listeners and to all those who are present this morning, thank you very much for coming. Mine is the task to simply welcome you and to say that I was given the honor of saying a few opening words because when this first conference, or when Kiran first called me with regard to this conference, we had a long conversation. And he says, are you going to say the same things you said to me now? Because it's important. People have to hear that. And unfortunately, being a senior person, I have to say that I forgot what we talked about. So I'm going to say a few other things. I had to call him yesterday and ask him, what did I say to you again? So a few other things did pop into my mind. I'm by training an accountant. I'm in the business of finance. I've run a few banks in my time. And sustainability hasn't always been at the top of our head. In fact, it's the last thing that we think about. I also lecture in project finance, and salvage value and decommissioning costs are something we think of at the end. And when you put that into the context of sustainability and what it means, it really is that business, generally speaking, does not take into consideration the true cost of a product. Because the true cost of a product is not just simply the acquisition price. It's really all the other things that happen afterwards. And we call it the total cost of ownership. And the total cost of ownership is, generally speaking, looked at from the operating income side. In other words, how much is it going to cost us? And unfortunately, our theories don't take into consideration what we call, from a theoretical point of view, negative externalities. That's a big word, negative externalities. And what it really means is that literally almost everything we do is not encapsulated in the purchase price of the item. So for example, we buy a bottle of water or buy a car. And for us, the cost is what we pay for it. The reality is that there's an ongoing cost. The cost that we don't see, the cost of decommissioning, the cost of maintenance. And from an environmental sustainability perspective, the most important thing is the cost of decommissioning. So for example, nuclear plants give off heat, generate energy, supposed to be one of the cheaper forms of energy. The only difficulty is, what do you do with the spent fuel? How do you store it? How do you destroy it? And it just so happens it takes a couple thousand years for that radioactive waste to become decommissioned. Now consider that in the course of our lifetime and the lifetime of civilization as we remember it. It takes about the same amount of time for that nuclear waste to literally lose its potency and its power. It's about the same time as it has taken us as human beings to get to this particular point in time. So we are burdening, in a sense, the future of our grandchildren. Where, therefore, and how do we come to terms with the difficulties associated with it? Because it really now becomes a matter of people's interest and what we consider vested commercial interest. And the UN Secretary General this week spoke literally to the energy sector companies in the face of the fairly bumper profits that have been made during the course of this year that have also become an embarrassment from a political perspective. Because at the same token, whilst we're talking about energy and energy sustainability, people are also having to undergo the difficulties in terms of inflation and the impact of those costs. And what do we do without energy? And in the same token, what is a reasonable price for energy in those circumstances? Now, when you take that into consideration and you think about it, really and truly speaking, we should be pricing energy at a very high point, which is precisely what the energy sector companies would love, but what the consumers don't want. And that brings us down to the issue of interests, where the different interest lies. So, for example, in the case of Trinidad and Tobago, one of the key things that we know is that we have a proliferation of plastic in our waterways, which add to problems, particularly in the rainy season, where we get these sort of micro events which ensure that we have too much water in particular areas, and then the whole question of the flotsam and jetsam that comes up and where does it go? Now, that most companies don't see themselves as having a responsibility for. And it shows itself up in the fact that the container bill has taken, I can't remember how many years to get passed. Right? So clearly there are interests which are not served by the container bill. But the reality is waste, plastic waste, really doesn't seem to have a price from the perspective of, if it did have a price, we wouldn't throw it away. And that's the fundamental issue. So how do we change that so we become more tuned to conservation, and how does conservation affect the whole question of climate change? Those are some of the very difficult issues that we have to face from a personal perspective, because also it affects our lifestyles. And those interests are replicated through the system. We don't want to make changes. We talk about it. Climate change is important to us. We understand, because it's about destruction, effectively. And it's difficult for us to come to terms with that. When we talk in terms of economy, we talk about growth and development. Climate change puts another spin on it altogether. It talks about sustainable growth and development. And that's a type of costing that we have not factored into our business models. To the extent to which that from a business school perspective that we've understood that, and that we are putting on a program ourselves in March, which deals with the issue of sustainability and through conscious capitalism. So that's one of the things that we have to face. But the critical issue, of course, is the differences in interests at a political level, at a corporate level, at an individual level. And it requires changes in behaviors at all levels. And not only does it require changes in behaviors, it also has an impact in terms of how much it's going to cost us. And that's really when the rubber hits the road. Right? The difficulties are who's going to pay. And the reality is that the way the business model has worked, it has presumed that the corporations will make money by selling the items, and that governments, municipalities will pick up the costs in terms of what we call negative externalities, all those floating bottles and so on that have not been collected, but at the same token, gum up the works. And that brings us to another environmental concern, which of course is not the basis of our conversation here today, but the issue of plastic. Right? And the fact that microplastics are now very much into not only our lifestyle, but in terms of our biological chemistry. And those are issues that we also have to face. So that there are many implications as we move forward. So today is a fair amount of discussion. How as a country, are we going to address some of those issues? And my job is just simply to kind of put some issues on the table so that you can understand them, and from a perspective of business perspective and a sense, country economics perspective, these are the issues that we have to face, not only from an investment point of view, how do we change our investment patterns, and how do we make our investment patterns more sustainable? How do we deal with waste in a fashion which fits in with our requirements and what we have signed up to? So thanks for coming. This is the place where some of those ideas have to be discussed and also some of the implications thrashed out, and we're happy to be a part of it. Thank you very much for your time.
Okay, thank you so much for that. Very good question. Who is going to bear the cost? Spoken like a true accountant. I'm going to deformalize the proceedings a little bit. So at the start I said my name is Karen. So no one needs to call me Dr. Naz anymore. At the end of the proceedings, I'll still have a doctorate and I'll be okay. So you all can call me Karen. I'm not going to read all of the bios. I'll read some. The next person coming up to deliver opening remarks is Mr. Neeraj Tiwari, who is the head of AMCHAM. Please welcome him.
Good morning, everyone. If you ever hear me calling Karen Dr. Nile, shoot me. Mariano Brown, Executive Director of the Arthur Lockjack Global School of Business. Kishan Kumarsingh, Head of the Multilateral Environmental Planning Unit. No, almost. At the Ministry of Planning and the Environment. Indu Sharma, Chair of our ESG Committee, and other specially invited guests, ladies and gentlemen, all. And, oh, I see Stephen, the new CEO of the Chamber, in the audience. And thanks for coming, all of you on Facebook. Mariano raised a number of issues, and there's a lot going through my own head. When Karen and I started speaking, and I'm so happy that Karen took a haircut for this event. We started talking about that, the need for unified Caribbean leadership around meeting our global commitments. And we said, well, who's going to come to a session on that? So we had to find a way to try and make it relevant to our membership and policymakers, and we wanted to have an outreach to future policymakers and leaders, and through the IIR to try and get some of the academics involved as well. Because one of the things that we try to do at AMCHAM Trinidad and Tobago is bring people and interests together to be able to find ways to get stuff done. It's not always easy, and we don't always succeed, but the disconnect between what people are discussing, what the actual policy intent is, what the legislation may or may not come to be in some future stage, and what our international commitments are, or what others are making as international commitments for us that we then have to either respond to or accept, are very, very real considerations that we don't always think about. But they ultimately impact businesses and lives at the end, right? So if we're not part of the process, if we choose not to be part of the process, then we have a problem. And I would say we have a tremendous, tremendous resource in Kishan, who is a global leader in this field, and who is here, and who has been engaging and trying to engage through various political administrations, which is an important factor in this. And we as a business community need to do a better job of supporting that through understanding what is being done, as well as putting our issues on the table and having a discussion around that, and finding ways to link with academia, whether it be the COSTAT, whether it be the Arthur Lockjack Global School of Business, whether it be the Institute of International Relations and the like, to find those points of common interest so that we can also help to produce some data, and so that we can try to do some analysis. And they're not always the same thing, but you can't do proper analysis without data, right? So how do we play more of a role in that? Some of it is just putting issues on the table and having the conversation going. Some of it is supporting the work of the public servants in the public domain to tell the politicians that these things are important, because they're very diplomatic, and Kishan is very senior and will stay in his lane but do his work. But sometimes, at the end of the day, there are political decisions to be made, and public servants will have to deal with whatever those political decisions are, but could benefit or be hurt by the advocacy of civil society, including the business community. So if there's the discussion around the fund and who's going to fund it and how it will be used and what are the rules, are we not supposed to be playing a role in that, and doing so not just as the Trinidad and Tobago private sector, but as the regional private sector? So Republic is a regional company. JMMB is a regional company. So how do we use those things to have a more positive and meaningful engagement in the society? And at AMCHAM Trinidad and Tobago, we have long said, we are not ever going to advocate for a single company's interest, and we are not ever going to advocate for something that we think is in somebody's or some group's short-term interest, but not in the long-term interest of the country. And if those two things collide with a member and we lose a member or two, we will. We have lost one single member, for our stance on diversity. People said, that one person said, we're too woke. So we're like, all right, cool. But that's what we believe, right? So we don't have, and this is not me only, it is me personally, but it's not me because I'm not the organization. This is the philosophy of AMCHAM Trinidad and Tobago. And so that's part of why we are doing here. We're doing this today, and we were keen to partner with Karen. And I must say, sometimes academics in particular come to you and they're like, no, I want to do this. I want to talk about this. Karen was very open to saying, okay, how can we talk about this, but try to make it relevant to a wider audience? And that kind of discussion is very, very helpful. So we launched our ESG committee last year, and Indu is leading that and getting a lot of support from members. We intend to have our inaugural conference in April, and Indu will talk more about that. And the committee is seeing that as not as a one and done, right? It's a 3-year, at least, in the first instance, horizon. So let me stop there so I don't take anything away from that. But we do hope that you all would engage around that. And I can't end without acknowledging the work that my colleague Melissa Pear is doing in this. She was at the back. I think she went outside. Is Melissa still here? Candy? No? Okay. Melissa Pear and Ariana Gaidin have been doing a lot around building an agenda that is meaningful, because we don't want to do things just to say we do them and tick boxes. Inevitably, it will happen sometimes, I'm not going to lie. There's sometimes you just get something done. But what we want is a cumulative impact of all the work that we're doing to actually make a difference. It's easier said than done, but that's what we're working toward, and we're hoping that the discussions here would give us additional guidance, additional points to consider, and additional touch points with you to try and find those things on which we could work. And as we think about threats, we should also think of opportunities, of course. That's something nobody would argue with. But how many of us think of the threat of not doing something? See, sometimes we think, okay, if we do this, there's a cost and a risk. But we don't think of the risk and the cost of not doing it. And that's where I think we fall down in our planning and in our conversation. And I think we need to infuse that more in how we have these discussions. Yes, we know, and we're talking about what will happen to the environment if we continue doing what we're doing the way we're doing it, yes. But and we then think, okay, what does it cost? What is the risk of doing something this way? But what does it cost and the risk personally, for our companies, for our employees, for our communities, nationally, globally, of not doing it? And therefore, the whole risk model changes, right? The whole cost model changes. And so how do we find those ways to do that? And then if more of us are doing it, then the impact and the cost to remediate or stop falls. I'll give you a very, very small example and then I'm done. So we have a little football club. And one of the things that recently started, and one of the things we do with the boys now is we tell them, go clean up the field before and after. And it's like 3-4 weeks since the beginning of this year, we started doing that with the field. You know what's happening? There's less and less litter on the field. Because during school, they're telling people don't litter on the field. Because they don't want to have to go and pick it up, and they know we'll make them pick it up. And then after the matches, there's less litter on the field because they're picking it up. And so if we create that mentality in all that we do, there's less and less cost at the end. Cost being the time and the effort and having to pick up nasty stuff at the end of the practice or the match. And same thing in our businesses and in our communities. So I'm not going to go into all of the policy issues because I really feel unqualified to do so, even though Melissa and team did a great job of putting them in the speech. I don't want to be inauthentic. And I think we have a lot of very smart, knowledgeable people coming up who will raise all of the policy issues that I was going to raise anyway. So thank you very much for coming. Thank you for your attention and your time. And I look forward to the rest of the session.
For those that might be interested, my haircut is actually on Instagram. Would you believe? And yeah, the barber was just like, whoa, you haven't been here in a while. I was just like, you begin to sound like Nirad. Teaching my class on climate policy and economics, I said, I'm really happy that they're increasing the price of electricity. And one of my students, they were enraged. They were just like, so how are you going to say that? You don't care about poor people. I was just like, I said, let me be clear about this. In this wonderful Twin Island state that we live in, we don't pay the true cost of electricity. You don't pay the true cost of water. You don't pay the true cost of waste. I mean, the list can go on and on and on. I said, you don't live in the real world. When you travel to another country and those prices hit you in your face, then you'd be like, where in the world have I been living? And I would say to you, in the government's bosom. What I said to him was really, really clear. The cost of, for example, water, like what we spend in a year. I remember one year we spent like $3 billion and only collected like 600 million. the gap between 600 million and 3 billion is what we had to find money for. And that money is usually loans. And those people that lend us the money want their money back. I can guarantee you, I have been in those rooms. They want their money back. So I said to the student, what is going to happen eventually is the electricity that you use now, the water that you use now in particular, is going to be paid for by your grandchildren and your children. I said, does that sound fair to you, to anybody? And I said, furthermore, let's just be clear, on the electricity side, the top 100 users of electricity in Trinidad and Tobago use as much as the bottom 36,000. So this is not about poor people. Poor people don't have a jacuzzi and a spa and a tennis court and a squash court in their house, no. And central air conditioning. I said, there's already a rebate available. And to be honest, we have over 200 social safety net programs in this country for a population of 1.4 million people. I said we genuinely need to support those that cannot afford it. But for everybody else, they need to pay. And we need to stop subsidizing rich people to use energy in the country. It really is that simple. I said, that's a policy issue. And I said, these are issues I've been dealing with for years, because before I was at the University of West Indies, I was at the Ministry of Planning and Development. And the person I'm about to introduce was my colleague. And I'll be honest, I've never seen somebody in the service as dedicated to a singular cause as the person I'm about to introduce. You know, we have unsung heroes sometimes that work and work and work. When everybody else leaves, they're still working. And I said to my students, the people that actually run the country are not the people that you vote for. And I said, you should be very thankful about that. I said, and the people that you criticize as public sector, when you go to an office and no one is answering the phone, and no one looks in your face, and the service is bad, I said, beyond that, there are people working really, really, really hard. On this issue, Kishan has been working, I mean, I don't want to make him sound old, but for a while. I mean, I was going to call it date, but I mean, he has a few gray hairs, so I'll let him sell his own age. He has worked on this in terms of at Oxford University. He's worked on it at National Renewable Energy Laboratory in the States. He's been working on this for many, many years. And it is a great, great pleasure to introduce him, not just as a speaker, but as a colleague, and as someone who actually really believes in what he's about to speak about. So I want to introduce Mr. Kishan Kumarsingh to talk about COP27, where we are now, and the areas that require collective action. Please make him feel welcome.
Thank you, Karen, for the kind and very generous introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. And Karen is right to a point. But let me say first off that my slides, I have a presentation, so you don't have to look at me all the time. It's 44 slides, be warned, but I won't speak to each slide. I'll go through them. It's for completeness only. Everyone knows that I could speak about this for years, but I won't keep you so long. But let me start by saying that the points made by both Mariano and Nirad are perhaps the concluding statements that would have come after, and I will draw upon them when I get to the end for some illustrative points. So I think, yes, there we go. And let me warn you that I don't know how to use this properly. It looks like a TV remote, but let me see. Good. All right. So I have 30 minutes, which I hope I could stick to. But let me, before I get into the nitty-gritty of this, maybe give you a bit of a history lesson and a crash course in climate science for everyone who can understand it. So climate change is not new. this has been happening for years and years, millennia, thousands of years. It has happened naturally. The Earth goes through cycles where you get warm periods and very, very cold periods. So why is it an issue now? It's a natural thing. It's an issue now because it's happening at a rate that is faster than ecosystems and human beings can adapt to. And why is it happening faster? Well, stick a pin. Now, the Earth's temperature is maintained at some level that is livable. And the reason why it is maintained at that temperature is because of something called greenhouse gases, which include carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide for the scientists among us. Because these gases trap heat. During the day, the Earth warms up, because as you know, the temperature is like about 32 in our part of the world. And during the night, it cools. And how it cools is that the excess heat re-radiates back into the atmosphere. The greenhouse gases actually trap this heat and keeps the Earth at a particular temperature. And these gases, carbon dioxide and oxides of nitrogen, primarily, methane and others. Why is it an issue now? Is because the concentration of these greenhouse gases are increasing. Why are they increasing? Because of man's activity. What specific activities? Primarily the burning of fossil fuels, like oil and coal and gas, which gives off tremendous amounts of these greenhouse gases, and also industry, the industrial sector. So it's happening now at a faster rate than which the emissions can be reabsorbed in the natural cycles. And the signal that climate change was an issue, or could be an issue, is not new. For those of you who may have done physics or chemistry, would be familiar with the name Svante Arrhenius, from the various principles that he would have had enunciated on. He wrote a paper in 1896, not 1996. 1896, and I think in the lingo of those days, and I'm paraphrasing, the title of the paper was The Effect of Carbonic Acid Upon the Temperature of the Ground. Which carbonic acid, meaning carbon dioxide, it was called carbonic acid at that time. And it postulated that the temperature of the Earth could increase if the concentrations of these gases increase. And he actually shot the range at which the temperature could increase in the 21st century. And we are seeing that now. So this is not a new thing. And the warnings have been there even at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So with the Industrial Revolution, we had all of these greenhouse gases going up in the air. Temperatures started to increase. When the temperature of the atmosphere increases, it dissipates it in the climate system. And therefore, we see things like climate change. So the words global warming and climate change have been used interchangeably. And now we have settled on climate change, not so much global warming as, again, because the effect of global warming and climate change is you can actually see some places getting colder, as counterintuitive as it might seem. So in the late 1970s, 79, I think was the first climate conference where scientists got together and policymakers to identify this as an issue that required some attention. In 1989, the UN General Assembly recognized it as a threat to mankind, and then passed a resolution to negotiate a legally binding instrument to address this issue, because it was a global issue. And so the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was negotiated and adopted in 1994. So I'm giving you a bit of a brief history as to what 27 means. So at the first meeting of the Conference of the Parties, which is what COP means, is not a political party, the first conference realized that the convention itself and the obligations there to reduce greenhouse gases were weak, and mandated the negotiation of a new instrument to strengthen these commitments for industrialized countries, for developed countries of the North. And the Kyoto Protocol was adopted in 1997, which only had obligations for reducing emissions by developed countries. And the Kyoto Protocol had one period for which developed countries were to be accountable. And that was between 2008 and 2012, called the first commitment period. Needless to say, no one met their commitments, except I think the European Union. And the second commitment period, which was then negotiated, several countries withdrew, and starting with the US at the beginning of 2000 when the Bush administration started. They withdrew from the Kyoto Protocol because at that time, the US accounted for about 30% of global emissions. Then you could see how ineffective the Kyoto Protocol would have been in any event. But during the course of history and time, emerging economies, the Chinas, the Indias, the Brazils, the Mexicos, and the Koreas, and so on, started to emit more and more greenhouse gases, the so-called emerging economies that are now part of the G20. And so it was recognized that targeting developed countries and industrialized countries alone will not necessarily solve the problem going forward. And so the Paris Agreement was negotiated, and I did have the honor, if I could call it that in retrospect, to chair or co-chair the negotiations of the Paris Agreement in 2013 and 2014, 2012 and 2013. I'm getting very senior, as you would know. Maybe it's not that, maybe it's a period that I probably would want to forget. But anyway, the Paris Agreement was adopted, which now is in effect and which seeks to have every single country in the world, from the most advanced OECD country to the least developed island state now, who have signed up to the Paris Agreement, now has an obligation to put forward commitments called nationally determined contributions, NDCs, to reduce emissions based on their own national circumstances, hence the name nationally determined. And so countries have come forward and have submitted their plans to reduce emissions, including Trinidad and Tobago. We were the first in the Caribbean to do that. But what the science is now saying is that when you add up all of the commitments and the reductions that would accrue, assuming that all of these commitments were to be achieved, the trajectory is still short of what the objective of the Paris Agreement is, which is to constrain global temperatures to 1.5 degrees beyond the pre-industrial levels. We are on track to realizing between 3 to 4 degrees rise by the end of the century. At this moment, we are already at 1.1 degrees Celsius rise. You might say, what does that mean, really? You go outside and it's 15 degrees, you're okay. You go outside and it's 35 degrees and you're probably still uncomfortable, but you're okay. But what does 1.5, 1.1, what does that mean? Let me give you an idea. At a warming of 1.5 degrees, which science also says we will achieve or likely to achieve in the next 15 years or so, well before the targeted 2100. At 1.5 degrees, between 90 and 95% of all coral reefs, and I'm using this example because this is something we are accustomed to, between 90 and 95% of all coral reefs will be gone at 1.5 degrees warming. At 2 degrees, virtually all coral reefs will disappear. And if you know how corals grow, it will take hundreds of years, maybe thousands of years to come back to the original form. And coral reefs, as you know, are sources of food, pharmaceuticals. They form natural barriers to storm surge. And for small island states, that's very critical. So we are at 1.1, and therefore 1.5 is likely to be achieved in the next decade and a half. And we are well on the way to between 3 and 4. Who knows if life would, I'm sure it will be very uncomfortable and challenging, but it's possible. I wouldn't be here to know. But certainly our grandchildren or maybe great-grandchildren will probably bear the brunt of that, and it comes back to the point that Mariano was making. Who bears the cost? But what cost are we talking about? And I'll come back to that. So the COP process is an ongoing process where governments come together to negotiate on the best way forward on how to constrain these temperatures, because it's a global effort. And the premise is that if it's global and it's human-induced, then the solution should also be global and human-induced. And therefore, the COP27 was the 27th conference of the parties since the convention was adopted, and it was held in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. And this is where we are now, so I'll just get into the presentation. Might be a little bit technical, but forgive me, it's for completeness. So I'll look at it, it's divided in some of these, in these broad areas. So going into COP27, this is what the globe looked like. It was set against the backdrop of the previous COP at Glasgow, COP26, where the Paris Agreement rulebook, or the rules by which the Paris Agreement was is supposed to be implemented by countries, was completed, so that now countries are, after years of 6 years of negotiations, are now sure of what they have to do to implement the Paris Agreement. Ahead of the COP, the presidency, the Egyptian presidency, did make it clear that they wanted the COP27 to be an implementation COP, which means putting plans in place and actions in place to actually tackle climate change. It was set against very damning scientific reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the sort of recognized authoritative body that pronounces on the science. And the IPCC 6 assessment report was released in August of 2021. It comes out every 5 or 6 years, and this is the latest installment. And what it reported was that these are the basically broad headlines on what climate change will cause. And the world is already set to pass the 1.5 by 2040. That is the trajectory. But it will have severe implications for food production, for food security, and by extension, human health. And we've already seen some severe global catastrophic events in the past year. If you look at, we've seen levels of the Colorado River, I think it was at the lowest. We've seen some rivers virtually dried up, and it's all over China, Europe, North America, Australia, wildfires that we've never seen before. So climate change is no longer ahead of us. It is upon us, and it's something that the globe and everyone will have to deal with. But what does it mean for the Caribbean specifically? And I'm sort of preempting the conclusions that will come from this. And this is the headlines of the IPCC report. Global warming hasn't slowed. And we've seen at the 1.1, and as I said, life in the Caribbean will teeter on the edge of viability if global temperatures reach 1.5, because 1.5 was scientifically deemed to be the comfortable level of temperature increase with which humans can live. In excess of 1.5 degrees within next 20 years, the Caribbean played a critically important part in the last stages of the negotiations in Paris, where the actual 1.5 to stay alive campaign was perpetuated, and under the and I would have to recognize them, under the leadership of then St. Lucian Minister Jimmy Fletcher. The reference to 1.5 in the objective of the Paris Agreement was included. However, even with the increasing in emissions, limiting global warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees is still possible, but it will require very, very strong political will globally from all countries. But for us in the Caribbean, we must collectively lobby for greater global greenhouse gas reduction, because we account for less than 1% of total greenhouse gases. However, we must also reduce our own emissions at the same time, because there's a maximum, climate finance is something, we need finance to address climate change. That's enshrined in the convention, it's enshrined in the Paris Agreement, but there's a maximum law that says he who comes to equity must come with clean hands. So we can't go and lobby for money and finance and say, well, we are vulnerable, we'll be affected by climate change, but we want to continue to emit and contribute to the problem regardless of how small. So turn a blind eye to that. We have small amounts of emissions, that's okay, but we want money because you guys are causing pain to us, which is also true, but it has to be balanced in terms of equity. So we have to also reduce our emissions. That's the premise upon which the Paris Agreement is based. Global warming will continue to cause extreme weather events, We've seen that, as I mentioned, globally. Heat waves, heat extremes are part of the new normal. Small islands, including the Caribbean, will be experiencing or have been experiencing extreme warming that can be attributed to human influence. There's also declining rainfall. The climate models project that over the long term, we will have decreased rainfall and therefore decreased water availability. But in the short term, well, in that same period, we'll have more intense rainfall episodes, because if you have a global warming, then you have increased evapotranspiration, and whatever goes up must come down. And therefore, you'll have more rainfall in less time. We are seeing that already. The meteorological records at PIAC are already showing that for some years now. We are seeing flooding in parts of the country that were never known to be areas of perennial flooding. Flooding used to be south of the Caribbean River issue. Now it's in Aruca and it's in Marajh, and some of the places that you least expected. So it's already happening, and the damages that it is causing is already evident. Sea level rise will also increase because of the melting of the ice caps, which is now accelerating because of the thermal expansion of seawater as a result of increasing sea surface temperatures, which will also cause bleaching of corals. So it's a nice hodgepodge and a mix of interactive and indirect and direct influences and impacts. So it does not only affect land areas, it affects oceans, because carbon dioxide, which is the primary greenhouse gas, is an acidic gas. Remember Sven has, that says carbonic acid. It dissolves in water to form carbonic acid. And so the pH or the acidity, the pH levels are decreasing in the oceans, which means that the acidity is increasing. And with the acidity increasing, it actually shifts the balance of, sorry to get a little technical here, but it shifts the balance between carbonate and bicarbonate ions in seawater. And corals use these ions for building their skeletons. So these ions, IONS, will not be available for corals to build. So in addition to sea surface temperature increase, decimating them, there's also the other flip side of the impacts arising from increasing acidity of the ocean. So climate change is seen as the great multiplier in terms of exacerbating impacts. So because of the interrelationship between water resources, agriculture, food production, food security, human health, and all of those things, and their interplay, climate change will now increase all of that. And how bad it becomes, of course, will depend on us, not us in the Caribbean, but us in the globe. So going into COP27 against that background, had a very unique set of alignment of geopolitical circumstances. We had an energy crisis as a result of the Ukraine war. We had a food crisis, a finance crisis, a debt crisis for most of the islands in the Caribbean. We had floods, global floods and extreme weather events in Pakistan, Nigeria, forest fires in Europe, hurricanes in the US, and so on. But as we got into the discussions, parties agreed that the issue of what is called loss and damage had to be addressed. Loss and damage means what is permanently gone or destroyed as a result of climate change, beyond which you could probably adapt to. So if you lose a beach because of sea level rise, there's no amount of measures you could take to return that beach because of sea level rise. So the COP had, the discussions had, of course, the formal negotiations on the agendas, which I probably would not get into, but it also identified 6 areas that required high level or high political discussion and declarations and intervention. And those were related to food security, water security, finance, energy security, and futures, vulnerable communities, and the need for a just transition away from fossil fuels. And I'll come back to that in a bit. So these are basically the outcomes of COP27, what was called the Sharm el-Sheikh Implementation Plan, decisions on loss and damage, the Santiago Network, I will explain but not get into detail, a mitigation work program which recognizes there is a need to ramp up the ambition to reduce emissions in order to keep the 1.5 trajectory. Possible issues related to adaptation or coping with the adverse impacts of climate change, and of course the ever-present issue of financing developing countries to address the adverse impacts of climate change. There was also the issue of Article 6, which relates to carbon trading, and the rules are still being refined on how carbon can be traded. And I know that's an area that is of keen interest to the private sector here in Trinidad and Tobago. And of course, there's a global stocktake, which is a global coming together of governments to assess whether actions being taken by respective governments is sufficient, what are the gaps, what needs to be done, and how governments can then learn from those gaps and go back home and revise their plans and their actions to keep the 1.5 trajectory alive. And so that global stocktake is scheduled to take place this year at COP28, that big meeting, but it's a provision of the Paris Agreement. And there were other matters looking at the long-term global goal and some other things that I'll touch briefly on. In addition to the formal negotiations or the formal discussions under the intergovernmental process itself, there were many side discussions between governments as well that resulted in international pledges. And this is a recent feature of the COP, in which governments meet on the side and they make declarations and they pledge to do things supportive of the formal process. And COP27 basically resulted in some international pledges related to fossil fuels and renewable energy, reducing methane, issues related to deforestation and securing food security or securing agricultural production. So the main outcome of the COP was what is called the Sharm el-Sheikh Implementation Plan, also known as the cover decision. And for the first time in the 27 COPs that have been held, the cover decision mentioned food, rivers, nature-based solutions, tipping points, and the right to a healthy environment as a human right came explicitly clear. These were kind of nascent and latent principles and understandings that governments had and negotiators had. But for the first time, we saw these being explicitly mentioned. And of course, the need for the transformation of the financial systems and its structures were also explicitly mentioned, in addition to what is required under the formal legal instruments, the intergovernmental legal instruments like the Climate Change Convention, the Paris Agreement, where developed countries are to provide finance to developing countries to allow them to, or to enable them to make good their obligations. And I suppose this part of the transformation of the financial system and structures took the cue from Prime Minister Motley's utterances at COP26 in Glasgow the year before, which took on which got more traction at COP27. It also launched, importantly, a work program on just transition. And what does just transition mean? Just transition is a term that was coined in the 1990s by trade unions in the US when it became apparent that tighter environmental policies may have impact on industry and therefore jobs and so on. And climate change, no different. It is recognized that addressing climate change, both from a reducing emissions perspective or even from addressing the adverse impacts of climate change, can have impacts on livelihoods, workers in the oil and gas sector, workers in industry, and so on, that may be displaced, and there might be some intended or foreseeable consequences, but also unintended consequences. And so the just transition concept really is to buffer any socioeconomic unintended consequences arising out of the need for the energy transition in going from high carbon intensity economies to low carbon development. And Trinidad and Tobago has developed a draft just transition policy. We're the first in the Caribbean again to do that. My understanding is that it is before the cabinet for consideration and approval, and we've now started to look at an implementation plan for that. And I think the Energy Chamber had some discussions on this last month. So in recognition of the need for more ambition to reduce emissions, the decision asks countries who have not yet done so to increase their ambition by revising their commitments and submitting it by the end of this year. So while the cover decision covered many things, there were some things that it did not cover. So what did the cover decision not cover? It failed to advance the ambition on the 1.5 degrees and ignored growing calls for fossil fuel phase out. In fact, India led a call to address the phase out of all fossil fuels as part of the outcomes, but it was resisted, and therefore what sustained was the status quo that left COP26 in Glasgow. What was significant about that was that for the first time again in the negotiations, that references to fossil fuels were made its way in a formal decision. For the first time in the 26 years of negotiations where fossil fuels were always seen as the culprit for causing human-induced climate change, it was for the first time in COP26 that the word fossil fuels actually made its way explicitly in written form in a decision. But there was no advancement on or building on that at COP27, so it didn't cover that. And well, I'll leave it for you to read, and basically that's what it did not cover. One of the significant outcomes was the agreement to address issues related to loss and damage, and this is the actual negotiated text decision. And basically, parties have agreed to establish a process to explore ways for financing loss and damage, and this was critically important for small island states because of all of the things that go with being a small island state. And therefore discussions will now begin on that coming this year. And to do that, a transitional committee was established to do all of these things for new funding arrangements for loss and damage. The thing to note here is the decision to establish a fund or funding arrangement, financing doth not make. So even in if you agree to have a fund, which is a huge win, the fund is only as good as the money that it will attract or the capitalization that it will be realized. And therefore, that is one issue that will be topical in the coming year or two. And therefore, this is one of the things that for the Caribbean, for small island states generally, we would have to keep an eye on in terms of how we see that progressing. Again, this is for completeness. The Transitional Committee will see after all of these things in its deliberations. So there's still a lot of work to be done, which is the bottom line. So a lot of negotiations are yet to take place on how the arrangement of the fund will be designed, how it will be capitalized, where the proceeds will come from, and so on. And that takes some time. That can take a few years. The GCF, for example, the Green Climate Fund, which was established formally in 2010, didn't happen until about 5 or 6 years later when the first capitalization was realized. So in spite of the agreement, there were pledges made again on the side for addressing loss and damage. And Australia, New Zealand, and Belgium committed to contributing about $300 million looking at loss and damage, or to fund loss and damage. And this really marked a paradigm shift and a gear shift in attitudes to funding loss and damage, which for years has been a taboo, a bit of a taboo in climate finance. And the reason for that is the issue of liability and legal liability based on historical responsibility. And there have been a few cases in the US and internationally where some small islands, I think, in the Pacific actually tried to get an outcome for suing countries that were historically responsible for these emissions that have caused loss and damage. And in fact, when loss and damage was negotiated under the Paris Agreement, there was a a clause in the accompanying decision of the Paris Agreement that specifically stated that it should not be interpreted to mean any issue of liability. It was a comfort clause. I don't think it has any legal teeth as such, but I think it was a comfort clause to actually get the Paris Agreement adopted at that time. The Santiago Network really is a supporting network to provide technical capacity and support for issues related to loss and damage. One of the more significant outcomes was the mitigation work program, which again was conceptualized on the realization that the emissions gap, what is called the emissions gap, in other words, if we are to stay on course for achieving 1.5 degrees by 2100, emissions, global emissions, have to be reduced by between 40 and 45% by 2030. That's 7 years from now. So it's a daunting task, and therefore, where are those emissions are going to come from? Who's going to pay for it? The actual reductions, and financing is a continuing discourse. But in recognition of that, the mitigation work program was established, and the objective, of course, is to also engage ministers at the high level to get more political will injected in the work program and in the consequent government actions, respective government actions globally. However, in recognition of all of what I've said, the decision did stress a non-prescriptive and non-punitive approach, and therefore the program, the mitigation program, will not attempt to undermine the enshrined principle of NDCs in the Paris Agreement, which is nationally determined and therefore bottom-up by nature. And the decision does not mandate or request stronger pledges, but recalls the request made last year, which is a repeated request, and also relying on the science to do this. Similarly, a global goal on adaptation has been identified in the Paris Agreement, and discussions on what this should look like continued at COP27. And this now brings me to the issue of finance, which is the underlying, which is really the elephant with pink striped pajamas and a large top hat and big goggles and tall top boots roaming the room. It's the elephant in the room in any of these climate change negotiations. Sorry, Kevin. I see you like that. But anyway, so finance remains an issue, and it became even more topical following the Copenhagen conference in 2009, at which developed countries pledged to contribute the equivalent of $100 billion per year by 2020 to make it available for developing countries or to enable them to undertake actions. That pledge was never met. And therefore, the finance remains the single most trust-breaking or trust-making issue among countries and mutual confidence. And so the conference at COP26 decided to launch a new program, work program, which I had, again, the honor, if you want to call it that, of chairing last year, to define a new climate goal, a new quantified finance goal by 2024, using the $100 billion that was promised as a floor, not as a ceiling. And therefore, these negotiations are expected to quantify that amount in excess or moving up from 100 billion. What it does highlight is that is the identified or estimated needs of finance that needs to be invested in renewable energy. So you're looking at 4 trillion per year up until 2030 to reach the net zero emissions by 2050, and a global transformation to a low carbon economy is expected to cost about 4 to 6 trillion per year. And of course, delivering such funding will require transformation of the financial systems and its structures and processes, engaging governments, central banks, commercial banks, institutional investors, and other financial actors. So that is one of the more topical issues that occurs not only within the formal negotiations, but also outside of it Again, that I said that. And basically, the decision calls on shareholders of these MDBs to reform their practices and priorities and to align and scale up funding with a view to ensuring simplified access and to mobilize climate finance. And also encourages the MDBs themselves to define a new vision and commensurate operational model that channels financing made on a fit-for-purpose basis. I wouldn't get too much into Article 6. This is just for completeness. This is really the carbon trading article of the Paris Agreement, for which there's a lot of interest, but for which the rules are still being defined. Because let me just quickly add what it could mean, or the implications. And we are at the moment developing a carbon trading policy and a carbon pricing mechanism. Let me quickly, how am I doing for time, Karan? I see you staring at me. I'm trying to ignore you, but I can't.
Well, we want to hear this part.
You want to hear this part? Yeah, I do. I know what I'm doing. So, yeah. So, carbon trading basically is you're not trading a virtual commodity called carbon, which is traded as a reduction units. So, for example, if a country, let's say Trinidad and Tobago, who has pledged to reduce its emissions by 15% by 2030 in 3 sectors, if we can measure, as we can, the reductions that we achieve, we can sell that to some other country that may not have been able to achieve their reductions, and we get a price for it, price to be determined by the market based on demand and supply, normal kind of thing. But the trick with the Article 6 provision is that it's premised on a few things. It's premised on the issue of environmental integrity and no double counting. In accounts, it's called double entries. So in other words, if Trinidad and Tobago reduces its emission and decides to sell that reduction to some other party, and that party uses it towards its own commitments, we cannot use it for our commitments. We have to actually add it back, which is something called corresponding adjustment. So it adds a burden to our own commitments. So the policy and legislative framework on how carbon is to be traded needs to be carefully crafted because it can have adverse impacts and can create burdens for the state. So we're in the process of defining those rules by which participation in the Article 6 carbon trading mechanisms can take place. But that's it in a nutshell. Those things are still being sort of refined at a more granular level in the negotiations. I wouldn't go into all of those things. Yeah, and the private sector. It's a voluntary market. The private sector can participate. But like I said, the rules by which participation can take place needs to be defined. Otherwise, it can have unintended consequences in terms of burden to the state, specifically in terms of the commitments at the intergovernmental level, yeah, a multilateral level. The global stocktake will take place this year, which will again assess, as I said, the state of play, where we are. Are we on track? Are we not on track? What are the gaps? What do we need to do to come back on track? What should governments do? Blah, 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 blah. And hopefully at the end of the global stocktake at COP28, then we can see more action taking place. This is the issue of response measures is critical for countries that are carbon intensive because, again, the issue of cost comes up because reducing emissions in carbon intensive industries will have a cost, and therefore what would that mean for economies that are based on fossil fuel revenue when the whole world or most of the world decides that they don't want their fossil fuels again as part of the energy transition. So this is called response measures, and there are many things that are discussed under that, including the just transition issue that is now placed in a work program that has been established. There have been side talks, international pledges on fossil fuels and renewable energy, which takes place outside of the formal negotiations, where some nations themselves have pledged to phase out fossil fuels through several multi-country initiatives, one of them being BOGA, or Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, which is a small group of nations led by Denmark and Costa Rica that have committed to manage the phase out of coal, oil and gas production in order to meet the world's climate goals. And that was launched at 26. Similarly, there was one for fossil fuels and renewable energy. There was one for methane, the Global Methane Pledge, which was launched at COP26, and which Trinidad and Tobago is now part. Basically aims to, is a multi-country initiative, aims to slashing methane emissions by 30% by 2030. And 150 countries have now agreed to the pledge, including Australia, Egypt, and Qatar since COP26, and as well Trinidad and Tobago. There were also international pledges on deforestation, recognizing that deforestation is an issue for climate change, because when you deforest, you remove a sink that can take carbon dioxide out of the air through photosynthesis, but it also, when you deforest, you expose the soil, which is carbon rich, and the carbon dioxide goes up in the air. So deforestation causes emissions. So there was a pledge on reducing deforestation and so on agriculture as well, recognizing the threat to agriculture of climate change and the need for increased food security. So what is next? I spoke of climate finance. The designing of the loss and damage arrangements has to be fit for purpose, so that, because there's no one size fits all, every country has a different set of unique circumstances. But in order to enable action at the domestic level, creating the requisite enabling environment is critical, both from a policy, from policy perspective, from a legislative perspective, institutional perspective, administrative perspective, because if you don't have that in place, if you're given all the money in the world, you can't do anything with it. So creating the enabling environment is the first step, and this is something that has to be done at the national and the regional level. So I think that's my last slide, thankfully for you. Yeah, I think that's it. And so let me now come back to the points that were made earlier. So who bears the cost? And we spoke. I think Mariana spoke about externalities and so on. But the polluters pay principle is a well-established principle in international law. Our own Environmental Management Act and National Environmental Policy is premised on the polluters pay principle, which means that when you pollute, if a polluter pollutes, then that pollution has a social impact and therefore a social cost. And therefore the polluter that causes that impact and cost should pay. Carbon pollution is the only pollution in Trinidad and Tobago that is free. We have the water pollution rules under the Environmental Management Act. We have the air pollution rules, we have the noise pollution rules, we have the waste rules now. All of those are premised on the polluters pay principle. None is premised on carbon. So carbon pollution remains free. And that is why we are now trying to devise some ways of looking at carbon pricing mechanism that can incentivize or disincentivize carbon pollution, or let's call it greenhouse gas pollution. So who bears the cost? Most of the times we talk about these external shocks and so on, but we never understand the true cost of production. So I think Mariana spoke about the end product and decommissioning, but all of those costs don't actually also internalize the cost to the environment, the cost to society, and the cost of pollution, which if you begin accounting like that, you probably get a totally different picture. So the need for now developing climate resiliency from a regional perspective, not only to manage the impacts of climate change, but also to build resiliency from a sustainable perspective, from a sustainable energy perspective, from sustainable food production, from everything, from consumers, from the circular economy, is an imperative that is required at the Caribbean level, because we are a small region of many small countries. And that is one of the imperatives that would be required to contribute to the climate change solution, so that when you look at the circular economy, how do you minimize waste? The notion that development, you have to pollute to develop, in my personal view, this is not an official view, but in my personal view, the right to pollute, meaning a right to develop, is an antiquated 20th century school of thought. We are nearing the end of the first quarter of the 21st century, and we've gone past that stage. And so now we need bold, transformative, and innovative thinking to really take us out of this and to really leapfrog the sort of handcuffs that we've had to past paradigms. Which reminds me when President Kennedy wanted to go to the moon, and he called the scientists. He didn't ask them if it was possible. He didn't say, is it possible to go to the moon? He said, how can you get me there? Today, we're on Mars, I think, with other aspirations to go further. So I leave it at that to maybe as a good segue to get some thinking going in the panel discussion. The bottom line meaning that business as usual is very risky business. And I leave it at that. Thank you very much.
So it's time for practical discussions. I want to thank Kishan for those words. We're going to talk about what the role of the private sector actually is in terms of who bears the cost. What does this mean for Trinidad and Tobago as a small and developing state? Can we become world leaders in this field? I want to invite the respondents on stage. We have our esteemed panel of respondents. I would invite them, Ms. Indu Sharma, Dr. Danelle Dhaniram, and Tisha Marajh. And of course, I want to, Kishan, can you join us again at the end of, on that end of, and I'm going to take a seat there so we can jump right into the discussion one time. All right, let me just, at least so people know who you are here and online, let me do a brief introduction of our panelists. Indu has been an attorney for over 30 years experience. Again, I'm not trying to age people, my apologies. It's written here and they gave it to me. She is the principal consultant at QED Consulting Limited, which is a consulting firm committed to improving governance standards and practices in all sectors of the economy. She's currently a Chancellor's representative on the Council of the University of West Indies St. Augustine campus and holds the position of chair of AMCHAM TT's Environmental and Social Governance Committee. Tisha Marajh has more than 20 years of relevant experience in the field of sustainability and ESG. She's worked with the City of Toronto in water conservation and public education, and as a lecturer at Seneca College of Applied Arts and Technology in Canada before returning to Trinidad and Tobago in 2008. She has two specialized graduate and undergraduate degrees in sustainable development in sustainable development and environment from York University in Toronto, Canada. And she is currently the senior manager for group sustainability at Republic Finance Holdings Limited. And then finally, Danelle started her career working on environmental projects in the oil and gas sector for approximately 3 years, followed by policy development and implementation, working on technical guidance documents for emerging legislation in the UK and position papers for environmental standards for the European Commission. She holds a MSc in Science of Management of Tropical Environments, specializing in renewables, and a PhD in Policy and Risk Management from Imperial College London. She is also a member of AMCHAM TT's HSE committee. You all should really applaud the committee during your contributions, and has extensive experience in policy and risk management, strategic planning, and managing health, safety, and security. Please join me in welcoming our panel of respondents. So I'm going to give each of you 5 minutes. I'm going to start with Indu, and then we're done with Tisha, and then save the best for last. And then we will have a discussion, right? So, and then we'll be opening up for questions. So please, I hope you have your questions ready to ask in person and online as well. So, Indu, over to you.
Thank you, Karen. It's a pleasure to be here at the Lockjack Graduate School of Business. While we were looking at our safety video, I noticed the words leadership, transformation, and impact. And I think one of the themes that we want to talk about today is really leadership, transformation, and impact in terms of meeting our NDC contributions as in Trinidad and Tobago, as well as in the region. I'm here in the capacity of chair of the AMCHAM Environmental and Social Governance Committee. And it's a recent committee that's been formed in the last year that is focusing on how do we move the needle in terms of application of environmental and social frameworks, and how that can help us with respect to meeting our commitments, our national commitments as well. ESG frameworks essentially provide us the opportunity to take a very hard look at our businesses, identify risks and opportunities, perhaps solve some really big problems as well, and help us create value in growing and transformation of our businesses and our economies in terms of small island states. And as Kishan said, we suffer some very peculiar impacts of climate change as smaller island states. And from our perspective at AMCHAM, in other words, what we're saying is that the implementation of environmental and social governance frameworks can help narrow that gap between climate pledges and the actions that we need to take in order to meet those pledges. We see that implementation of ESG frameworks presents an opportunity to achieve also meaningful and sustainable growth in terms of our own economies, potentially in the short to medium term as well. So of course, government policy plays an instrumental role in creating that enabling environment. But from the AMCHAM perspective, we are very keen to play a collaborative role with government in developing practical policies, a very practical policy network, supporting the private sector and our membership in implementation, as well as helping to drive mitigation strategies, adaptation strategies, and building resilience in our businesses and our communities. So how we're going to do that is the subject of this conversation. There's no doubt that the impacts of climate change are already being felt for us here in Trinidad. And it's not an exaggeration to say that storms, flooding, sea level rise, temperature rise, and reduction in our biodiverse environment are already having tangible impacts on our economies. For example, we're potentially seeing the decrease in the value of our asset base due to flooding. That's an impact for business. We're also seeing the high cost of insurance and reinsurance, and that's also a high cost to business. You spoke about the sort of global commitments around the loss and mitigation fund or loss fund. But on a practical level and within our own businesses, we're seeing those costs add up as well as as we're seeing reduction in value in assets. So these are things that impact our ability to stay competitive, and we really need to be laser focused on staying competitive, especially at this time. So we feel that helping to drive the implementation of environmental and social governance within business is going to help us maintain our competitiveness and help us mitigate and build resilience in our businesses. In the 90s, I don't know if you all may remember, there was I'm a big movie buff, and there was a movie called Deep Impact, and it was about what they called a meteor coming to hit the Earth, and it was called an extinction level event. Now, climate change, in my view, is an extinction level event, not only from the natural world perspective, but also from an economic perspective for our small island states. And whereas we may not see it as a meteor impact or a comet impact, it is a progression over time. And we need to really try to arrest that, and we all have a contribution to make. We think at AMCHAM that it will take building a network or an ecosystem of collaboration, both between the public sector, the private sector, all aspects of our economy, and the financial sector as well. And I mean, Tisha is here on the panel, but there's no secret that it will take access to capital to help build that resilience within our economies. There's a lot of international capital from the international private sector that is also available. It's kind of mind-boggling, actually. Bloomberg has estimated that there will be about US dollars 50 trillion of private funding available based on ESG criteria. So why shouldn't that funding be accessed by us in the Caribbean? Why should we not have the opportunity to use that funding in our environment and in our businesses, right? So what will make that happen? How will that actually happen? First of all, government has to create the enabling environment, and we have some suggestions in relation to how that enabling environment can be created. First of all, we don't think that we need to reinvent the wheel with respect to environmental and social governance frameworks and criteria. International markets already have those criteria well established, and we just need to try to align ourselves in a tangible way. We don't really need to reinvent the wheel in terms of standards and regulations in relation to that. We think that government also should support and give incentives for the implementation of environmental and social governance frameworks and adaptation and resilience projects, okay? And this could also include increased incentives for listing on regional capital markets, because what we need is capital inflows, whether they come from the region or whether they come from international sources, to help us with this transition. And I think we want to suggest as well that our regulations, when they are formulated, are simple, consistent, and reliable, so that they don't change too much over time. Because in business, reliability and understanding your regulatory base and dealing with your regulatory base is also very important and helps maintain competitiveness. And this is not to discount our responsibility in the private sector. Okay? Businesses need to become familiar with environmental and social governance frameworks and enable agility and resilience as well, and the sustainability of their businesses as well. So it's our responsibility as the private sector to also take the lead, and it is part of that collaborative process. What is the difficulty that we are seeing among our membership and wider businesses is the how-to. And at AMCHAM, we are very focused on developing a roadmap for the how-to. we intend to support our membership and the wider business community in sharing practical advice and tools that can help businesses of all sizes and all models along that ESG journey. Again, we believe strongly that we all have a contribution to make, and we are very focused on that, how we're going to do that. As Kishan said, we need to come with clean hands, right? And we need to potentially also deal with the added burden of our NDC commitments if we get into carbon trading as well. So it's not a simple equation. AMCHAM will be hosting its first inaugural ESG conference on April 26th. And this really has the objective of driving implementation of those ESG frameworks, creating alignment through collaboration with all stakeholders, including government, the institutions like the University, Arthur Lockjack School of Business, and the financial institutions who provide the capital. We will also be aiming to present a baseline data study on where we are in relation to how companies prioritize and treat with their ESG frameworks. And so we want to be able to assess over a period of time how companies are dealing with creating positive impact, demonstrating leadership and transformation in terms of this contribution to our national commitments. We will have discussions or collaborative discussions around the opportunities to rebuild our regional economies via capital inflows and trade expansion. There will be a discussion about building resilience in communities and businesses through the implementation of frameworks. And we're also going to touch on scientific innovation and the creative sector as well. The second day of the conference is really going to be dedicated to workshops, and that also will help with the how-to. We will have an ESG 1 workshop. We are developing a self-assessment toolkit, and we are also looking to partner with audit companies that provide energy resource or resource audits that can help measure our contribution to carbon emissions. We intend to collaborate with ICAT, other learning institutions such as Arthur Lockjack, in order to build the skill capacity to be able to make this transformation in the economy. So we have a little bit of a roadmap already, and we are looking forward to that collaborative approach. It's a very, very exciting time, I think, for all of us. What remains to be seen is how we actually implement, how we get the needle moved over the very short term. And we look forward to collaborating in that regard. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I know we have about 15 more minutes left. Danelle, over to you.
Hi, good morning, and thank you for that lovely introduction. My name is Danelle, and I represent TOSL Engineering, so part of the private sector. Sorry.
That's okay, that's okay.
Yeah. And one of the things that stood out for me this morning is listening to Kishan, and he said, the pace of warming is outstripping the pace of the region's response. Reduction of global emissions need to be at 45% by 2030. So what does this mean for the Caribbean? What are the opportunities for Trinidad and the wider Caribbean region? Where should our focus be? What has to be done? I mean, looking at coming out of COP27, there is potential for global funding. There's a $7 trillion US fund. There's the adaptation fund, US $230 million. So how do we have access to that level of funding? And what do we do as a Caribbean nation in terms of unified leadership? So we must start by getting all our stakeholders involved, having a clear understanding of what are our roles and our responsibilities. developing systems in terms of the how. How can we as a Caribbean region have access to funding that could assist us in our journey, as well as ensure that we become environmentally sustainable? Also to mention, at COP27, an opportunity for improvement that was discussed, the development of proposal that meets the requirement of the funding agencies. So how do we bridge that gap, and what are our options going forward in terms of getting some level of funding for the Caribbean region? I mean, leverage knowledge and experience from the private sector is an opportunity for us, especially in terms of research and development, development of policies and procedures, project implementation. The construction industry has a wide span of knowledge and experience in terms of scope development, project execution. And something that Kishan touched briefly on as well as is also in terms of the private sector, in terms of opportunity, is the mention of the carbon markets. So how can we tap into the carbon market? How can we put ourselves in a position where we can now trade carbon credits, former carbon credits now called ITMOs, under the Paris Agreement? Yeah, so. And I mean, the decision in terms of going forward is heavily dependent on government intervention. So authorization from the government of Trinidad and Tobago in terms of authorizing the sales of the ITMOs, as well as development of the MRV system. So we have some system in place to track mitigation outcomes and avoid double counting, as Kishan would have talked about earlier. So, in terms of being part of the private sector, I think the private sector, and I can speak for TOSL, we are fully on board in terms of being able to assist where we can to reduce our carbon emissions, both locally and regionally. And we are happy to assist the public sector in any way that we can going forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You can clap, you know, that's okay. I know some of you wanted to clap. You can clap, really. We are going to come back to the trading points that you made, and we're going to, for those of you online and here wondering about some of the acronyms used, we'll define them, MRV and ITMOs. We'll come back to, remind me, we'll come back to it. But Tisha, over to you.
Thank you, Kiran, and thank you to AMCHAM and of course Arthur Lockjack for inviting me and to represent Republic Finance Holdings Limited here this morning. I'll start by saying I'm not a banker. But I've been in this field, the sustainability field, for about 25 years, meeting Kishan when all his hair was black. So it's quite a long time. But I've spent a lot of that 25 years being frustrated, anxious, depressed, because of what was happening and what we saw happening to, in the space of climate change and the planet. And Kishan spoke about the evolution of that time in terms of where the discussion started to where it is now. And I think I can finally see some light at the end of the tunnel in terms of the silos that these discussions and the talk shops and so on that was happening is now coming to a more collaborative, inclusive sort of arrangement. And I mean, everybody here spoke about the financial sector being the most critical. And really that's where our bank, Republic, sees ourselves fitting in. And to absolutely agree with what Kishan said, pollution is not a precursor to development. I tell my staff this all the time, this is the 21st century. We need the innovators and people like the students here today to really innovate the way forward. So to really give you just a snapshot of what the bank is doing and, in terms of time as well, Republic Bank would have, I think made a very public commitment. Republic Bank being the 14 countries in which we operate throughout the Caribbean. So we are a key player, and we're also in Ghana in West Africa. And we are a growing bank as well. And Republic Bank has, at the strategic level, made the commitment to develop and to go forward under ESG, which most people know is environmental, social, and governance issues, which over time in any business would have caused the most risk in terms of losses and reputational risk and so on. But it's also a space now where there's tremendous opportunity. Indu just spoke about the $1 trillion industry and an opportunity that is there. And yes, we want to do the right thing, but we're still a bank, and we are open to investing in all those avenues. Also, UNFCCC, 3 C's, right? they are now accompanied by the UNEP-FI, which is now going to set, which is what Republic Bank has signed on to in terms of the principle of responsible banking and net zero banking alliance, where we are among more than 200 financial institutions across the globe, which we have several commitments that we have to make by signing on to these commitments. And you'll be seeing more as we go along. So the bank is already establishing our ESG strategy. We are already starting to disclose and work out our science-based commitments under the United Nations Financial Initiative's Principles of Responsible Banking and Net Zero Banking Alliance, which of course is to not only reach net zero by 2050 internally, but to also encourage our clients and customers to do the same by changing our policies to represent that. You know, we also are now aligning. Now, Republic Bank is one of the biggest CSR funders throughout the region. So we are now changing the way we also do that. We are now assessing all our CSR projects that come to us under the realm of not only ESG, but the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. We have strict sector indicators which are guided by the SDGs, where we now evaluate in terms of sustainable livelihood, you name it. So that's what we're doing as well. Republic Bank has also, we have understood that we need to make our commitments very public. So we have set several financing targets for ourselves, which may be of interest to the financial sector, the private sector. So we have set a US $200 million climate financing goal, and where we want to look for and support projects among the private sector that are ungreenwashed, real climate change or climate adaptation or mitigation products. We also have, and you will notice this would also mirror the critical areas Kishan mentioned in his slide, the critical areas in terms of climate, food security, small business, and so on. We also have a $100 million US agriculture fund, which we also hope to meet in terms of promoting financing under sustainable and livelihood generating agriculture. And we also just formulated a Center for Business Innovation, which focuses primarily on our small and medium business owners, because, you know, the expectation that the big business can reach climate targets and ESG is, okay, fine, they have the money to do so. But we need to build that capacity in our small and medium business owners. So we also have a $100 million TT fund. So the other two funds are group-wide, but this fund we're starting it in Trinidad. So it's a $100 million TT that we hope to build capacity in ESG and climate within our small and medium existing and new clients. And we have a specialized unit to do that. We have been meeting with a lot of these small businesses, especially small farmers and so on, to make that happen. So we are also looking at the new and emerging types of financing arrangements. And before I go into that, just to say briefly that yes, we are looking at concessionary sort of applications when looking at people coming to us for financing for climate and ESG. So we look at concessions, different risk profiles, maybe longer payback period, because we recognize these are the gaps. This is why people can't have access to financing, because we are using traditional types of evaluation methods. So we're changing all that. So we're looking at the new markets that we're seeing in the Caribbean, for example, the blue bond, green bond systems that was just finished for Barbados and in Belize. We're also looking at the carbon markets because we do operate in Suriname and Guyana, and they have already approached us on a country level to look at that with them. And we, Grenada, our Grenada Republic Bank is, I think, looking for accreditation as an entity within the Green Climate Fund. And we're also moving towards the S part, of which people don't often talk about when we're talking about ESG and climate financing, the diversity, equity, and inclusion aspect. Looking at how we can change our organization to be more reflective of changing global trends, women-run businesses, you know, how we treat within diversity and equity and inclusion, and to transfer that into all our policies and procedures. So, you know, really, I know time is a factor, but I think, you know, somebody made the point, I think is Nirad, that, I think either Nirad or Kishan, that small island states, we want money. We make a small contribution to climate emissions, but we still don't want to make necessary changes. And I think that's going to be said with businesses who do come to banks and so on for financing. Okay, yes, we want to apply for a loan under our climate financing goals, but it's very greenwashed. They're not deep policies, and I think that needs to change. I think banks can influence that change by, yes, amending our lending agreements and conditions and so on to reflect the changing global patterns. But we can also we are really strong in a role as lobbyists for government change to actually start to get the national development plans to mirror that of what we finance. So I think there's a strong role for banks and business, and I think, you know, I commend the work of people like AMCHAM and the other business structures that are trying to have that collaborative approach, which I think Republic Bank is, demonstrating that we're willing to support.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Yes, welcome.
So first of all, I'm going to ask you for a bit more of your time, just about 15 minutes of it. Apologies in advance. It's now 11:26, so I'm definitely, and I want us to have a discussion. It's the discussion that we came here to have. You've heard a lot about carbon markets. You've heard Kishan talk about it, the opportunities to trade in usually what we refer to as certified emission reductions, CERs. We emit carbon because we produce petrochemicals. We are fossil fuel producing nation, and Guyana is about to ramp up. Suriname is ready. There's an opportunity to do this regionally, but there's also an opportunity to do this nationally. The acronyms that you heard before, one was ITMOS, that's Internationally Transferred Mitigation Outcomes, which is, again, when we're talking about trading between countries. And the MRV that you heard before was, I believe, monitoring, reporting, and verification, which goes towards reducing things like double counting. I want to have a discussion. Some questions have already come in online. Thank you so much. Now, of course, you can raise your hand if you do have questions. I'm just going to raise the questions that we already have online that were submitted. And of course, Nirad being Nirad, cheekily submitted a question before he left that he would like to have answered. So there are two questions I'm going to ask off the bat for the panel. Number one is, in terms of carbon taxes versus emission trading schemes, right? We've heard a lot about the possibility of trading. On the one side outside, Nirad was asking about the carbon border adjustment tax in the EU, which is how we may be affected by other person's policies. So I remember working with one of the attendees today, Dr. Keith Nurse in Barbados, and he would always say, you need to separate the impacts of climate change from the impacts of climate policy. Mm-hmm. Yeah? And this is an impact of climate policy. How do we confront that while in the same vein that you talked about, construct our own trading mechanism internally, right? That's the first question. I'm going to throw out the second one time so we can have a discussion. The second question that came in was about climate justice. What does that really mean in this region? And how do we ensure that climate finance actually meets the needs of mitigation and adaptation, and not just used for other things. So, those are the two things. Kishan, you haven't spoken in a while, so I'll allow you to go first. You can open us up, and then, of course, if anybody wants to respond, just let me know.
Is this to respond to Neeraj's question, or?
Yeah, you can start with Neeraj's question, the easy one.
Ignore it? Anyway, all right. Okay, the first one is
the carbon adjustment border tax. Yeah.
Okay.
And you can probably explain what that means if I wasn't clear in terms of what it means.
Okay.
And,
Yeah. All right. Fine. Okay, just some basics. When I had this slide up speaking about response measures, I think that's what you had meant by responding to the impacts of climate change and responding to the measures in response to climate change, which is broadly response measures. Now, the European Union has, I think as recently as March last year, or maybe a little bit later, October maybe, they are one step closer to implementing what is known as a carbon border adjustment measure, aka tax, at the border for importing goods that have a high carbon footprint. And I think there is a formula that they will use to apply the tax. And they have, in the pilot phase, looked at various sectors: iron and steel, cement, and fertilizers. And Trinidad and Tobago is a significant exporter of fertilizers to the European Union. And they are doing this, which are commensurate with and in alignment with World Trade Organization rules. So there's no, they seem to have covered all their bases in terms of any flouting of the WTO rules. And what their net zero plan, because they have a climate change, they have a climate law, and their net zero plan says that they will achieve net zero by 2050. But what they don't want is what is called carbon leakage, meaning to import goods that and cause emissions in a country where emissions regulations are lax. So they will now tax goods in these sectors that commensurate with their carbon footprint or their carbon intensity, including the power sources that they use, electricity, natural gas, or coal, oil. And I think there's a methodology that they've already. They're one step closer to allowing this to be applied by companies that import from countries that have these products from which they import. One of the issues there is then what would be the impact for exporters like Trinidad and Tobago. Now, it's important to note, because all of these things are linked. All of these things are linked in a very nice way, actually, where actions in one sector could actually benefit the other sector. So the reason why fertilizers and ammonia, which is the basis for fertilizer and urea and so on that we export, the reason why they have a high emission of greenhouse gases is because of the feedstock. And the feedstock is natural gas. And so, the natural, again, sorry to be scientific, so those of you who have done chemistry, natural gas is methane. So it consists of one carbon atom and 4 hydrogen atoms. The main part of the methane molecule, or the natural gas molecule that goes into ammonia, is not the carbon, it's the hydrogen. So the carbon, the natural gas molecule is split into carbon, which goes up as carbon dioxide, and hydrogen, which is really the valuable part of the molecule that goes into making ammonia. So therefore, hydrogen is really the real value of natural gas for the petrochemical industry, like ammonia and fertilizers. Now, the race for green hydrogen is on. The global race for green hydrogen is on. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE, all of the big oil producers and gas producers of the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, who could perhaps single-handedly determine the price of oil tomorrow, has signed an MOU with Germany to produce and to provide them with green hydrogen. And that is an opportunity for us in Trinidad and Tobago, I think. We don't necessarily need natural gas from a scientific perspective. How it applies in a business sense may require some analysis. But how green hydrogen is produced is you take water, you split it because water consists of H2O. It's 2 parts hydrogen to 1 part oxygen. So you run a current through it, you split it into oxygen and hydrogen, use the hydrogen, and if that current is produced by renewable energy, then you have absolute carbon-free hydrogen, which you can then use for ammonia production, for fertilizers, as a fuel for cars, as a fuel for ships, for power generation, and so on. So there is an opportunity there.
Kishan, hold on.
Yeah.
So I just want to make sure we all are having the same discussion. So number one, and this is something that we've been saying a lot, but in negotiations behind closed doors, but I want to say it openly, just to make sure we're all clear. Hydrogen is being viewed as probably one of the greener pathways to secure the future of our petrochemical sector. So particularly, and when you Google sustainable hydrogen, you're going to find green, blue, pink, brown. You're going to find many hydrogens. It's a fact. But what we need to look at in particular is the fact that it is possible to have green hydrogen. And in Trinidad, if we want to have a Point Lisas in 100 years, that may very well be the highway. And Indu, I see your hands raised.
Yes.
Go ahead.
So just to say that most of my career has been spent in the energy sector, both upstream, midstream, and downstream. And I think there is a tremendous opportunity for the energy sector operators to look at energy efficiency, first of all. For example, we have an LNG plant which exports LNG all over the world. There may be engineering solutions that are available to those plants to close loops and reduce emissions significantly. And this is one of the things that an ESG framework can provide for any company, a large one or a small one. When you look at the potential risks that might be presenting themselves, like a carbon tax coming into Europe, LNG is exported, for example, into Europe. So these are things that an environmental and social governance framework can throw up as potential risks to the business. And then it establishes the framework about how you're going to deal with those risks, how you're going to allocate capital, and how are those risks going to be mitigated or dealt with in whatever way. Okay? So I want to make that connection. I want to make that connection soundly, because we have to look at it from a country perspective as well, in terms of risks to the country, but also risks to business. And I do believe that operators in the energy sector are looking at those solutions already and looking at their carbon footprint. And I think it's up to us as non-energy sector participants or in the economy to look at our carbon footprint as well, as businesses, as communities, and so on. And an ESG framework can provide us that opportunity to look at that and help address those things.
And I would add that there is a policy that is before Cabinet that actually does advance a bit of what Indu just said, in terms of it says, including to the energy sector, we need to focus on energy conservation, then energy efficiency, and then look at renewable energy options for the country. But on that note, Danelle, coming to you now in terms of talking about the trading capacity or the trading possibilities for Trinidad and Tobago. Again, this is within the context of the future of our current industry. Where do you see yourself in terms of in TOSL? What do you all see as your role? But also, what do you think as a Trinidadian? What are the possibilities?
So, before I answer that, just to go back to the initial question, the first question that we got, just to mention, in terms of the carbon pricing mechanisms and the question that came in online, I think the ask there is really, how are we going to deal with our exports as a country in terms of double taxation? Because is it that we are going to have a carbon tax, and then when we export goods to the European Union, we have to have an additional tax placed on top of that? So I think that's kind of where it lies, and those are some of the things that we need to flesh out in terms of finalizing our policies locally. And back to your question in terms of the ITMOs and the carbon trading, I think there is an opportunity. If we look at some of these smaller islands like Dominica, then we have the Dominican Republic, who has already signed bilateral agreements, and they are currently in the process of carbon trading with CLIC, which is with the Swiss government. So I think the opportunity is there, and it also gives the private sector because it's voluntary to the private sector, once we have an agreement, can actually help in terms of project implementation. And it's also sustainable for us because, yes, in addition to trading carbons, we are also looking at environmental sustainability. So we're doing something positive for Trinidad and Tobago, so something simple as a waste-to-energy plant. It provides employment for the locals. We reduce our pollution, we reduce our carbon emissions, and we can even contribute to some of our NDCs where we have a system in place, as well as all our excess carbon we can trade out on the international market. So it's a win-win for everybody.
So within that context, coming to you, within the context of the conversation, what does climate justice mean? That was the question that came in. What does it mean for us?
You mean the context of what we discussed in terms of, because
so we're talking about the future of particularly the region, but also particularly Trinidad and Tobago and our energy sector here. We're talking,
I see it, over time in many ways, I mean, yes, I think what we suffer from a lot in the Caribbean is things happening in secrecy and in silos. So, we have all these great resources and all these great things going on, and, and so we know that the carbon tax is coming. We know it will make us somewhat uncompetitive if we are double taxed. We know that ESG legislation is happening throughout Europe, starting in Canada and the US, and we export goods and services, right? So I think there's a filter down approach, that does not happen. Sometimes we have these policies being developed, but it doesn't reach down to us or business, and we are sometimes catching up. And I think that has to change, because for the banking sector, we have to finance this. We have to finance any of these. So I know Guyana and Suriname, yes, they are now reaping the benefits of oil and gas, but they are, I'm sure, putting their transition plans in place because looking at global trends in terms of what's going to happen. So I think, I'm not sure if I'm answering the justice question, but I think, in terms of what climate justice really means is a whole wider discussion in terms of equity and so on. And I think that is something that is underdeveloped in the region as well. And while, yes, the banks can finance big transition plans, and yes, green hydrogen is happening because we have clients coming to us already on that. So it is happening. But then again, how does it reach everyone? So I think ESG is really an important strategy, because ESG really takes apart, if you apply it properly, and if you don't greenwash it, ESG really takes apart all those issues of environmental risk, social risk, and governance issues. And governance means things like accountability, lack of corruption, and so on, things that really cause problems. And I think if we apply it properly, ESG as a management tool in terms of environmental justice and how it filters down to, yes, okay, we're doing this, but how is the poor man getting water if a hydrogen facility is using all of it? And I think these are things that once you build in a proper ESG strategy, you deal with those things from a holistic and data-driven perspective.
Yes.
I think Indu, I'm coming to you shortly, but one of the key concerns for Trinidad and Tobago is that issue of just transition, like Kishan mentioned. It's going to take money to move from industry A to industry B, or operation A to operation B, in terms of different ways of doing things. But I think there's a lot of fear that we're going to leave people behind. I mean, we just closed our refinery, and it was not pretty. People are wondering, do I have a job, or would I have a job in a certain amount of years? Should my children study in this field? These are the kind of questions that people are asking, and what they are actually trying to do half the time is they're trying to follow the money, not necessarily the environment, but they're trying to follow the money. And I think these are important kind of challenges that we need to face head on. Indu.
So I want to touch on the point of climate justice briefly, because as small island states, the question of impact adverse impact is hitting us. And you have, within the region, you have a bit of an anomaly with Guyana, for example, because right now they are carbon negative. Right. As soon as they start to produce, they're going to create a huge emissions issue for themselves. And I am sure they're thinking about how that is going to impact investment in the country. I'm sure they're thinking about how that's going to impact the long-term future of their country. You know, there's a big movement in indigenous populations in South America, particularly around, you know, activism against deforestation, for example. Yeah. In Guyana, you're going to have a lot of capital inflows for development of that vast country. And how are they going to balance that in terms of managing their carbon bank, which is the forest of the Amazon, and also making sure that indigenous populations don't get left behind? Okay, so that's a huge, you know, huge issue for us, I think, and it's relevant and germane to us as well. We don't necessarily have a large indigenous population, but we do have impacts to people all the time, and I think they've been overlooked, and we have to really factor that into the equation. The issue of data gathering and measurement is really important. We all need to know what our carbon footprint is, and we all need to know how much electricity we use, how much we use as businesses and even as households and individuals. And I think that's really going to really drive change in behaviors as well. So we can't only rely on big business to do what they need to do. We also have a responsibility in this conversation and in this transition.
That's an excellent point. How many, by a show of hands, how many of you all know that you can actually access the carbon emissions of your own electricity use using the TNTech portal? How many people?
Yeah.
Okay, this is, I mean, with the audience, I guess. Wow, this is more impressive than my class. How many of you all actually check that data every month?
I don't check it. I have to admit I don't check it every month.
For those online that missed it, it was a lot less hands. I think that makes your point. The data is there, but even when it's there, sometimes we don't even check it. I think that's an important point for us to go home. Now, don't just do it this month. Put it in your calendar, put a reminder on your phone, check my carbon footprint from my own electricity generation at home. I think that's important. I can take one question from anybody. There is a mic over there. I can also bring a mic to you if you have a question. On this side, I'm going to bring the mic to you. I see Kevin and Keith, and then we can close off for the day.
Thanks. Thanks for a very informative discussion from the panel. I just want to challenge a little bit. I mean, I was really interested in coming because you spoke about the need for unified Caribbean leadership. And we've talked a lot about a lot of factors that impact. But I think what is really needed is a clear vision. And I think that the challenge is that civil society, government, everyone needs to put that clear vision forward and start in their space. Because what we are talking about is both individual, national contributions that roll up, but somewhere along the line we need to have a clear vision of where we're going and sort of challenge everybody to come along. And I think that is a missing piece. Yeah. I think we're really good about plans, like Vision 2020, great plan, Vision 2030, almost as great as Vision 2020, and yet we don't do the monitoring and evaluation. There's no annual reporting. Yeah. The private sector is not on board and engaged in a way that will allow for Vision 2030, my own view, to show up. And we need that level of engagement. And that calls for, at all levels, organizations to be really engaged. And I didn't hear that come out. I did hear Republic, and I know of their work in this space, but I would like to hear more from other companies in this space and other participants of how their individual visions are going to contribute to this. Because leadership does not necessarily have to come from government.
Correct.
That's my point.
I agree.
For those online that missed it, this is Kevin from the Solid Waste Management Company of Trinidad and Tobago. Keith Ness.
Thank you very much, Karen. I think, and you made the point earlier, referring to me, about the distinction between climate change impact and then climate change policy impact. And in that regard, one of the key issues I think that should be of increasing concern for Trinidad and Tobago, since it's a major exporter of fossil fuel-based energy products and services is the increasing demand in terms of reporting structures. So, the Securities and Exchange Commission is due to have their Scope 3 emissions requirements in terms of reporting instituted, I think, by next year, 2024. It means then that for the multinationals operating in Trinidad and Tobago, I'm sure they have that already in their wheel well, and it's being sorted out. The large firms in Trinidad and Tobago probably have it on their radar, probably not there yet, but the smaller firms operating in Trinidad and Tobago that are either part of the supply chain that would be needed for this process of decarbonization and reporting on it are probably and more than likely not there. So, what is possible is that we will end up in a scenario where an increasing share of our domestic firms, large and small, are not in a position to fill out all the requirements in reporting. This has nothing to do with their competitiveness. In fact, let me rephrase that. Reporting on your carbon emissions will become an increasingly important element of your competitiveness.
Yes.
We are not training people in this area. For sure, I can tell you that. Right? It means then that we are operating with an expectation that somehow this will be resolved. Yeah? But if we don't start training people in this area, we will be severely handicapped as an economy, and particularly with the energy sector that is a dominant player. Thank you very much.
Thanks. And for those online, that was Dr. Keith Nares, principal of COSTAT. I'm feeling sorry for you now. I see your hand, but we're out of time. You want to make it really, really brief? Yeah. Come on, really, really brief. Like, just because I know we had to go. You have a mic behind you.
So we spoke a lot today on engaging the persons at the level of UWI and Arthur Jack, but I really missed the conversation of us engaging the young people at the level of primary school and secondary school. And I know Republic is doing a lot of work in that area, but what about the others? What about AMCHAM? What is your thoughts on how we can engage that band of the population?
Okay, so you want to go first?
I feel like, a lot of this is coming to me, but so let's start with the last question. So you wouldn't believe this, but this morning, in terms of our dialogue around planning the conference, I had the idea, and I have to put it to the committee, obviously, to see if it is, something that is supported by the committee. Incidentally, these two panelists are also members of the AMCHAM ESG committee.
You have 2 votes.
But formation of a student chapter in relation to ESG, environmental and social governance frameworks, and how we can get feedback from younger people, because part of the conversation around social criteria is really being more inclusive and making sure that we are involving and taking into account in our planning the views of younger people, the younger demographic. This is so, so important. And the future is yours, right? And so you have to have a say as young people in how things are fashioned, how policy is fashioned, how businesses react. You're our demographic. You are the people that we are, catering to and servicing, right? So that's one point. Kevin, I do agree with you that the fact is this is not a government responsibility, right? Our national contributions are not a government responsibility. But what we feel at AMCHAM and in the private sector is that we have to take people on a journey. We have to start with encouraging. Regulations will come, but if we're not prepared for those regulations and we're not in that mindset already, then we're going to have a much bigger problem later on. So that's where AMCHAM is starting, and we want to support not only our membership, but all areas, all aspects of the economy to start thinking in this way And we think by, developing the tools, by raising awareness, we have, in fact, an ESG toolkit that's about to be launched. We have an ESG framework and ESG 101, which describes what ESG frameworks are. That's already been developed by AMCHAM in conjunction with the United Nations, and we're in the process of rolling out those things, right? Dr. Nis, I think the conversation around capacity is really, really instructive. We do have to focus on capacity building, and we also have to focus on the change in the economy and being prepared for the change in the economy. And that's a conversation that we want to have with the learning institutions. So we'd be very, our membership, the business models of our membership is changing. Those models are changing, sorry. And therefore, our members need to be aware and they need to be prepared for that. So we'd be very interested in continuing that dialogue with learning institutions.
On that note, I'm going to allow each other panelist to just say their closing remarks in response to different things that they've heard as well in terms of the conversation and on what you like to leave persons with as well. So, Kishan, I'll start with you.
I didn't hear the last part, sorry.
Oh, what do you like to leave people with? Like, any closing thoughts?
Oh,
yeah.
Leave people with. But I thought I left with a thought already, but no, but certainly to say that this is a transition. It's not a switch. It's not going to happen overnight. But at the same time, the transition has to be accelerated. We have to capitalize on all the opportunities. Because, as I said, when I left, business as usual is risky business.
Well said. Danelle?
I would like to close by just saying I do agree that we should have a clear vision in terms of a pathway and an implementation plan in terms of what are we going to do and how we're going to do it to meet our 2030 and 2050 targets. So the time is running out, 1.5 to stay alive. Let's keep that in our mind as we continue to collaborate and work together to make positive decisions.
Thank you, Tisha.
Yes, I think everybody's capturing what it is, but I think we need to remember that climate change is a global issue, and while we struggle to get things right and we make mistakes, I think we always have to keep that in sight. And I think if we are a country that has and a region that has signed on to the Sustainable Development Goals, Goal 17 being the most fundamental one, which is the partnership for the goals, and I think we need to work towards that. We need to work together and all the aspects, and I think when we do so in a realistic way is when we're going to see real change.
Please join me in thanking our panel of respondents. And as I think the only thing that is left for me to do is to really challenge us not just to think of the need for a vision as a government thing. What's the vision for your household where this is concerned? Climate change affects everybody. What's the vision for your business? And then we need to think about what's the vision for chambers, and what is AMCHAM's role in kind of rallying the private sector around the different needs that we have, including reporting, including making sure that we are not just doing this because of an international standard, but because the emergency is real for us and future generations. I want to thank Mariano for opening up and for allowing us to use this wonderful facility. So thanks to the Arthur Jack Global School of Business. Thank you very much, Neeraj Tiwari, CEO of AMCHAM TT. Thank you again to Kishan and Indu and Danelle and Tisha for coming out for this conversation. And of course, thank you to all of you. I want to thank the AMCHAM team. Melissa is actually here in the room. Please give her a round of applause. She did a lot of work. That's Senior Trade Policy Specialist at AMCHAM TT, and Ariana Gayadina, she's here as well. I also want to thank Michelle Siraj, who's from the IIR, who helped me pull this off. Thank you very much, Michelle. She's also in the back. This way. Thank you so much for your time. Let's continue the conversation. And for those online, thank you for logging in. Have a wonderful rest of the day.